October 31st of 1517, what is the event? Hint, hint, hint.
95 Theses, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's the date that is generally given by historians as the date that Luther, if Luther actually tacked the theses to the door. And that is, there's some question among historians as whether that's exactly what happened. But if that's the date that's given to him doing that, which is as marked, generally speaking, as the start or the major start of the Reformation. As we talked about before, we spent some time last week. We'll go back and look at that a little bit. Had there been reformers before Luther?
Yes.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about a couple of them last week. We talked about particularly these two, Wycliffe and Huss. Wycliffe in England, Huss in Bohemia, who had raised questions about a number of the same things that Luther is going to raise questions about in the Reformation. Sorry, go ahead, Mickey.
No, we're fine. We're fine.
Okay. Is Luther the only reformer of the classic Reformation?
No.
What are some of the other names that come to mind? We focus so much on Luther, and there's a reason we focus so much on Luther. Who are some of the other names that come to mind?
Calvin.
Calvin. Who else? Tyndale is a later feature. Zwingli, who's Swiss. Get that W started going there, and that starts happening. And we're kind of going to come to get introduced to about 3 or 4 others. But without a doubt, Luther is considered to be the most central figure of the Reformation for most folks. So my question is, what do you remember last week about, just a brief form review, what do you remember about Wycliffe and Huss?
English was responsible for starting some of the English translation of the Bible.
Okay.
German.
Bohemian.
Croatian.
And
died of natural causes. Killed.
Wycliffe died of natural causes. Huss was executed for his beliefs. And if you also remember that how did Wycliffe sort of miss being executed or potentially being executed? Do you remember that part?
I didn't write that part in my notes.
I thought the emperor, I think it was, or the king gave him permission to travel, and he was under the impression that it was more of a universal pardon. And when he went to the location he wanted to go to, they arrested him and tried him.
Yeah,
that's the way I recall it.
Huss is the one who was given safe passage to essentially his examination, and he thought that meant safe passage to and from, not realizing that the technicality was it only covered the getting there. And so he was arrested and executed. Wycliffe sort of avoids execution and the ultimate fate because it's during the period of time of the schism, the papal schism, when there's a contest over who is the pope. And so he sort of gets lost in the shuffle of all the conflict that's going on back and forth among who is the rightful pope and where is the rightful papacy housed at. And so notice the dates on these guys, 1384, 1415. In the case of Huss, we are a full 100 years before Luther. So the important thing to grasp out of that is the concept that many of the ideas that are going to show up in the Reformation, it's not like they sprung forth for the first time ever inside of Luther. And notice how much time had passed. Again, I mentioned this before. It's easy when we're talking about the big span of history and we're going through these things rather quickly to assume that these things happen in very tight time frames. 1328 to 1517 is almost 200 years. And again, I mentioned one of the things that I often do is sort of go back and say, okay, how long ago would that have been from now? We're back into the early 19th century. Andrew Jackson is president. if you're in the United States or something like that, just to put this in perspective about the time frame just from Wycliffe to Luther. So this is a slow, the point to be made there is this is a slow moving progress for several centuries, but it all is in response in many ways to many of the things that happened in that other important year that we talked about in 1215. What was the big event in 1215?
Was that the council, Fourth Lateran Council?
The Fourth Lateran Council established a lot of what became the dogma and doctrine of the church that these reformers have and take issue with, including Luther. So any questions about any of those things really quickly before we move forward? Don't want to spend too much time in review, but also don't want to get too much stuck in the past. All right. So I was going to I didn't do a slide for this, so I'll do it without the slide. Quick, sort of almost trivia questions. What nationality is Luther?
German.
And when we say German, what's the state of Germany during this particular frame of time in history?
Divided.
Very divided.
Divided like I know it as East Germany, West Germany?
No.
How so divided, Mickey?
You had principalities. You had Bismarck finally came along and finally united all the German states, but they were basically just almost city states. And then they expanded those city states, if I recall correctly, into more of a county type situation, but there's an awful lot of them.
200, 300 is the number you see tossed around. It changes from time to time. But there are lots of German princes. So they're Germanic as a people, but the only way that they are more or less united as a people is in the concept of they are German. They share a common language. For the most part, they share a common culture, even though there's some cultural differences even inside of what even become the two dominant areas of Russia into the 19th century. But the other thing to note is they are united in one other way, and that's we have the concept, remember again, of the Holy Roman Emperor. And by the time we reach this point in history, for the most part, the Holy Roman Emperor, remember that had been the title that had been given to Charlemagne, and then later was passed around in a number of different ways. By this time in history, the Holy Roman Emperor is almost always, even though it's an elected position that owes its connection to the church, the Holy Roman Emperor during this frame of time is almost always German.
Why?
It had just grown to that because of the way the politics of Europe had played out, the French and the English and everyone else. And so the Germans were typically fairly united under the heading of, normally the Holy Roman Emperor was German. And as a result of that, there was a common element of being German, and that was that you were under the Holy Roman Emperor. I don't know if I explained that very well. Does that make sense? There were like 300 different principalities, but your unity was the fact that you were all united under the Holy Roman Empire.
But the church is still in Rome at this point?
So the church is either in Rome or in
Or in-
Avignon, depending on where the papacy has moved to. That's the area near France. But the church is still singular. It hasn't broken up and been divided other than the
The
1054.
Eastern, yeah.
But it is also, the Holy Roman Emperor is, again, traditionally has started to come for the last 200 to 300 years during the period of time that we're talking about here, is coming out of Germany. It's almost always a German prince or German noble who is elected or given the position of Holy Roman Emperor.
So he's also the Pope?
No, he's the
No,
political authority.
He's the political
Right.
Holy Roman, but not the Pope.
Correct. So, any questions about that? And we'll see why that's important to mention here in a little bit.
Hey, we need somebody to mute. We're getting lots of background noise.
All right, so let's jump in a little bit more about, so Luther is German.
Thanks.
What else is Luther?
He's a monk.
Okay,
He's a teacher.
he's a monk and a teacher. Does anybody know what branch of monk he is?
Augustinian.
He's Augustinian.
Augustine.
We could spend a whole bunch of time, and we may circle back around to this at some point, but that was not the only order, that was not the only monastic order, right? There was also Dominicans, there were others as well. Later they would come to be others, but he happens to be Augustinian and was very much drawn to a lot of what Augustinian life was like in that respect. So he's German, he's Dominican friar, so he's in a monastery. What else do you know just off the top of your head about Luther?
He struggled with the thought of having done enough to keep out of purgatory.
He was very much a thinker and very much would get in. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through some of the evolution of some of his thought. Was he wealthy, middle class, or poor?
Wealthy.
Wealthy, okay.
Yes, they've
Another
gone
thought?
in They've gone in recently to find his home, and they found out that he came from a fairly wealthy family, from what I understand.
Yeah, he was certainly from a family that would be and probably considered at least upper middle class. They were merchant class. His father actually owned and had leases to mines and other things as well, but he was not noble. He was not from nobility. And part of the reason, one of the interesting things I point out here is a couple of things actually play in here that I think are somewhat important to know, is that he comes in a period of time, this is after the Black Death in Europe, or most of the ravages of the Black Death in Europe. And the Black Death in Europe had a tremendous transformation on two things. It had transformed the feudal economy from a feudal economy where everything was based on agriculture into more of a merchant economy. The Crusades and some of the things around that had also increased trade and made trade more important. And with, again, I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, anywhere from 35 to 70% of the population dying as a result of the Black Death. And that was, the church was not immune from that. The church became much more open in terms of who was able to go into church service, who was able to go into the clergy, and who was able to rise through the clergy. And so you reach the point by the time of coming to Luther that someone going for a seminary education that was not exclusively limited to non-primary sons of nobility, because there was more money in the economics of more of a middle class, the rise of cities, the rise of trade, the rise of merchants, and there were more openings, if you will, inside the church that needed to be filled because of what had happened as a result of the tremendous loss of life during the Black Plague or Black Death. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So Luther comes as upper middle class from a family that is not noble. He's able to go, initially his father wants him to study law, but he ends up studying theology. So let's look a little bit more about Luther, and then we'll talk now as we go through this. We'll be doing a constant biography of Luther as we go through the Reformation because it's an evolving biography. But we'll mainly focus today on his early biography and the thing that really leads to the event in 1517 to the theses.
Can I ask a question real quick? Do we know the difference between, have you already talked about this and I'm forgetting the difference between Augustinian monks versus Dominican monks?
We haven't talked about that in detail, and we may circle back around to it. I didn't want to get bogged down into it. The Dominican monks are the newer order of the two. The Augustinian monks have been around for a much longer period of time. And there were contentions between the various monastic groups inside of the church. So again, Luther is born in 1483 to Catholic parents. He becomes a monk and also a professor at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony. Again, initially his father had wanted him, he was not the oldest son, his father had wanted him to study law. Luther really didn't like law, but was drawn towards theology. Eventually he ends up joining the monastery and studying theology, and was not only a monk, but also became a professor and a teacher there at the university in Wittenberg, which is in Saxony, which is a part of Germany. So that's his early life. We'll talk more about some of the elements of his early life. One of the events I don't have a slide for here, but if you've seen any of the movies or other documentaries about him, does anybody know about the lightning on the road story?
I think we discussed it, didn't we, early on?
Yeah, we may have a little bit. Donna, what do you know about that?
Well, I just remember that. I don't remember the detail. But it had something to do with how he became a monk.
That's correct. This is before he had joined the monastery. He was on a road and apparently got caught in a pretty severe storm, and there was lightning around, and he was really scared that he was going to be struck by lightning and that he was going to die. And so he apparently, in that, sort of that foxhole kind of moment event, basically prayed for his safety and said that he would become a monk if he survived it. And so he survived the experience and he became a monk. He later relayed this story to many others as being one of the key moments in his life. And part of the reason what was one of the reasons he was fearful of dying? We've talked about this over the last couple of months, a couple of weeks.
Purgatory. The concept of purgatory.
Yeah. The idea that he wasn't fully, had not taken care of all of the penance elements for sins, and thus if he died with a stroke of lightning, he would have to endure purgatory for some period of time. And we'll talk about this more and more as we go through his look at that concept. He very much came to be concerned, particularly about what's the right word I'm looking for? Sincerity and penance and those types of things. So he's a student at the university, becomes a professor at the university, and he's teaching when we draw into the early part of the 15 teens. And so the other thing that's going on at this particular time is we're going to get introduced to this guy named Johann Tetzel. And in 1516, Johann Tetzel, who's a Dominican friar, so he's not of the same order as Luther, not that that's a huge thing, but it is important to note, he's sent to Germany to sell indulgences for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. So there's a need to do a fairly substantial renovation and rework of the most well-known basilica in Rome, St. Peter's, that's there in the Vatican. And that's going to cost a tremendous amount of money. And so Tetzel is assigned to Germany to go and sell indulgences, and the proceeds from those indulgences are going to go specifically towards the restoration and the rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome. So remembering what an indulgence is. What's an indulgence?
Get out of purgatory free card.
That's one way to think of it. It also is because you're contributing to the good of the church, you're drawing on the merits of the church, which is what allows you to offset as part of your penance that the sin that's represented by purgatory. So it's not that indulgences were new. It's not that indulgences weren't offered at other times for other reasons, but in this particular case, this campaign was to sell indulgences specifically targeted towards the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. Beyond that is also a very important concept in the sense that these were, for the most part, plenary indulgences. Remember what the benefit of a plenary indulgence is?
Like temporary.
It covered everything, wasn't it?
Plenary indulgence covered everything. So these weren't just any indulgences. These were super, super, super great indulgences. And that's an important part of the consideration.
So who would have been the one that had given the order for him to go?
The Pope.
Okay, that's what I figured.
So he has been sent with papal authority to go and to Germany. He's sort of like, he's almost like the agent for selling these indulgences in Germany. And again, what the purpose of these indulgences specifically were, where the proceeds were to go to the rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome. When Tetzel gets there, he ends up aligning himself with Albert von Brandenburg, who's the Archbishop of Mainz, one of the areas in Germany. And Mainz owed a considerable sum to the effort here being the rebuilding of the Basilica in Rome. And so he partnered with Tetzel. So this is the Archbishop in Mainz, who actually had, we talked about before, how how did people come into the position of being appointed to these various offices inside the church?
Being family?
What?
Was it family?
Family, but also it often involved money.
Yeah, bribery.
Yeah, what is known as simony. And so this was the case of Brandenburg, was that von Brandenburg, he had obtained this position of archbishop, but he owed essentially Rome a considerable sum of money for appointing him to that position, and he owed it specifically towards the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. So when Tetzel ends up in Germany to sell the indulgences, these two guys team up, and they basically form a partnership where most historians will argue that they were splitting the sale of the indulgences 50-50. Half of it was going through von Brandenburg, and he was using that to pay off his obligations. The other half was Tetzel directly sending back to Rome. So they show up in Germany, and this is the effort that's going on. This is probably the thing that set Luther and others off as much. What Tetzel would apparently do is they would send like these runners ahead into villages, sort of letting folks know that this special opportunity was coming. It's like a one-day sale. Get ready, get ready, get ready. And then Tetzel and his entourage would show up, and they would basically in the town square, he would preach sermons, and these sermons were very focused on purgatory and what was going on in purgatory. It was very much a pull at the heartstrings of those that had deceased relatives. And one of the things that he was, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, did you, have you listened to the last installment of the Luther in Real Time?
I have not. Does it relate to this?
Yes, it's very interesting. In it, they said that he even would do voices as if it was the deceased family members crying out for them to give the money.
Yeah, everything I've read about this or watched about this was that it was quite a show.
Yeah.
And it was, if you think very much like, the thing that comes into my mind is like modern, tent,
Yes.
shyster evangelist kind of things.
Right.
That's the feel that I get for it. Only he was definitely doing it under the guise of and under the direction of, he had the authority of the Pope.
Yeah.
Right.
And so one of the things that he would say is, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. So imagine that you've been put through this show with the voices and theatrics and reminding you about how your loved ones may be suffering even right now in purgatory. And all you have to do to free them from that suffering is contribute to the good cause. It's a good cause, right? It's rebuilding the Basilica in Rome. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you can hear the coin hit the bottom of the bucket, out springs the soul from purgatory. How do you think they did on sales?
Probably pretty good.
Probably quite well.
They did very well. But it was...
I thought the indulgence, though, was more for yourself than it necessarily was for somebody else.
It could be for either.
It could be for either.
So Tetzel is somewhat successful at doing this. Von Brandenburg is enjoying the success as well. And if you're the people there in Germany, you actually feel like you're getting something, right? You're freeing your deceased relatives or friends or whoever you're contributing on the behalf of. You're freeing them from purgatory. So everybody wins, right?
Yeah.
But as you can see, this is pretty extreme. So Luther is not the only one who is upset about this because he thinks it's teaching a false concept. It's not that Luther does not believe in purgatory, and it's not that Luther does not believe in indulgences. Let's be clear about that. At this point, he'll change his position on that, but at this point, he is still inside of what you would call Lateran Council orthodoxy in terms of believing both of those. He simply is opposed to the practice that's going on with Tetzel under the unknowing to Luther approval of von Brandenburg. So Luther actually writes to Brandenburg to object because he's the archbishop, the local archbishop, not knowing that there's a connection between Brandenburg and Tetzel. So Luther doesn't know that he's complaining to the guy who's part of what's going on.
So he was doing it to the archbishop because the archbishop would have some kind of a
Connection to Rome, or could tell Tetzel to stop.
tell Tetzel to stop. Okay. I was going to say, why wouldn't he write to Tetzel? Is Tetzel the one who's mainly doing the sermons?
Yeah, Tetzel
doing
is
the voice and...
Tetzel is the guy going around doing it. So Luther's initial protest is through what means or mechanism?
Through the political.
He goes up the chain of command.
Yeah, the political chain of command.
Yeah, he writes to the highest local authority within the church, expressing his concerns. And most historians agree that he included in this letter to Brandenburg some element, maybe the exact elements of the 95 Theses. But this was sometime in October of 1517. And so what is purportedly to have been tacked to the door of the church is also what is sent to the archbishop. And particularly number 86, I think, of those basically says is, why does the Pope, who has access to all of these resources, feel the need to do this? And that sets things off. So whether it's Luther tacking the theses to the door, whether it's him sending the letter, and remember, most people believe that when he's tacking the theses to the door, is that an act of protest?
No,
What does he do?
for discussion or debate.
Yeah, he wants to have a debate about this. You know, am I the only one that's concerned about this? What do we feel about this? But very quickly, what he finds himself in the middle of is he's now the focal point of what's going on around this particular concern. And so whether it was the tacking of the theses to the door, whether it was him sending the letter to von Brandenburg, whatever the case is, he's now the one that's in the crosshairs as being at least in opposition to the practice that's going on in the area. Questions, comments, thoughts? All right. So here's at least one line drawing thing of, so there you see that's supposed to be Tetzel there in the with the staff perhaps, or this character here. Notice they would play drums. Notice this box.
That's a coffer?
There were various, the box, there were boxes that served two elements. One of those elements is, that's where the indulgences were kept that were being sold. They were sort of, sealed. Of course, you also had a place where you dropped the coins and the collection. And so this very much was a whole procession that would come through, all kinds of other things that would happen. And again, it was quite a little show that came through town. I haven't listened. I have that episode downloaded on my podcatcher, but I haven't heard it yet. So now I'm even more anxious to go back and listen to it.
Don, was some effort made to actually take the names of the persons making the contributions and the amounts?
I don't know the answer to that. In terms of there being like a registry type of thing.
Yeah, I don't see anybody with a ledger there.
Yeah, I don't think that there was, but I don't know that for sure. So I wouldn't want to speak definitively on it, but I don't think that there was.
So obviously, even though the Pope was relying on the contributions of poor peasants, he wasn't, well, he understood that there was divine authority in knowing who made a contribution and what it was for.
God knew who you were dropping
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
And that's what was important.
So was there a certain amount they had to give, or it was just whatever?
Generally speaking, there were, as I understand it, there were minimal amounts. And so you had to at least meet that minimum. And these were not small sums, relatively speaking, because part of the reason that this qualified for an indulgence was that it was above and beyond your normal contribution to the church. It was an alm. It was a special offering. Donna, do you know about how long that portion of that podcast episode is? Just out of curiosity.
You mean how many episodes or how
No,
long?
just about how long the actual,
Each episode is about less than 20 minutes.
yeah. So if I'd heard that, I probably would have just played it out as audio for us today.
I mean, it was, to me, one of the best ones so far.
Okay. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link to that on the Sunday school page, of course, as we talked about before. So this is what leads up to this event. And most of the 95 Theses are related to the sale of indulgences. It's not exclusively that, but most of that's there. And then this slide that I pulled here, there's also part of this that Luther believed, and nothing can be done. This is getting into Luther's belief, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, of what is salvation through grace. So the preeminent event that starts the modern Reformation is the tacking of the Theses, and the antecedent event to that is this particular unique aspect of selling indulgences. But again, indulgences, this is not new. Indulgence, remember, one of the things what were one of the things that were going to happen if you went on crusade? You're going to be granted a plenary indulgence, right?
Right.
So this is not new. It's just this particular, it's the sale of, I guess the point being is that Luther was not anti-indulgent. Luther was anti-selling of indulgences.
So did he get a response from Brandenburg?
Yes, and he ended up getting engaged with this guy by the name of Eck, E-C-K. And Eck is going to be the one who sort of is the leading person that that Luther has to encounter. And eventually what happens here is Luther gets his chance there's a couple of different ways he gets his chance. But there actually is a public event that happens at Leipzig where there's a essentially this debate that he's asking for happens, and it happens with Eck being the one who responds back. But essentially he's told, calm it down. Again, the other things about monks. Monks took orders of what? Or oaths or vows of what?
Poverty.
And also obedience.
Right.
And so, one of the things that becomes a challenge here is if he's told to sort of, calm it down, then that happens. The other thing we talked about this last week is the other thing that happens is this does not stay contained to Wittenberg and the area of Mainz where the Archbishop is. And how does it get out? How does word get around?
The printing press.
The printing press. And so the theses, which were written in Latin, were printed in several locations. And by January of 1518, so literally a couple of years later, they're translated from Latin into German, and then they're printed and distributed as well. So literally within a matter of 2 to 3 weeks after the translation from Latin to German and the printing, copies of the theses are now all over Germany, but they've also made their way to, start making their way to France. They start making their way to England, start making their way to Italy as early as the first part of 1519. So the period from late 1517 to early 1519 is when this becomes not just a local matter, Luther wanting to have a nice little scholarly debate. He's concerned about what's going on in his local area. This actually starts blowing up across all of the areas that are controlled by the church. Questions about that?
Don, do we know who first passed these theses from the door of the church to a printer to have them printed up?
Various
it wasn't
friends of
Luther, was it?
No, it was not Luther. Various friends of Luther did this. The one thing that I really came to understand better out of preparing to be able to teach through this part is, I think the word that I would put in front of Luther in this, at this stage in the Reformation, is I would put the adjective reluctant. He was willing to state a case, so he wasn't blind to what he was seeing, but he was not looking to draw attention to himself or to be the leader. He sort of gets thrust into this position by the fact that he's done it and the timing that he's done it, by the fact that he sends the letter to the archbishop and other things. Suddenly he finds himself in the crossfire, and all he intended to do was raise questions about this and ask the question, should the church be doing this?
I can just hear it when the copies were being distributed all over Germany and getting down to Italy. I can just hear the Pope declaring that the Russians are interfering in the election.
Yeah, what are those meddlesome Germans up there doing, right? As well. So this becomes the spark. This becomes the lightning rod for the Reformation, such that by 1519, now it's not these casual situations where Luther is being asked to, stand before various things or make various justifications for what he's saying, or to renounce what he's saying. But by 1519, the pressure is on him to formally renounce what's going on. And if he doesn't renounce, what do you think the threat that's coming from the papacy is?
Excommunication.
Excommunication. And we talked before about how dangerous or how impactful that particular threat was, because it meant not only that you were cut off from the church and the benefits of the church, which meant you were cut off from salvation, but it also meant what? It means you were cut off from society, so to speak. And so we have from 1517 to 1519 the growing spread of the concern, the controversy, the debate gets wider, and by the time the Pope gets involved in 1519 and moving into 1520, we suddenly find that Luther receives a number of communications from the Pope, basically suggesting you need to recant this, or the next thing that's formally going to happen is you're going to be excommunicated. Everybody up to speed on where we are? I don't want to proceed too much further down that yet. So ultimately what happens is by June of 1520, Luther receives a papal bull, a papal edict, which says that you are risking excommunication unless you recant at least 41 of the statements that you've made inside of the 95 Theses, and you have 60 days to do that. Basically, they put him under the clock. And however, during this period of time, Luther has been persecuted by having done this to some degree, obviously having taken the point, but he's also continuing to write other things about his theological positions. And so he ends up writing this particular one of his writings called, it's On the Freedom of a Christian. And that's in October of 1520. And he sends a copy of that to the Pope. And basically arguing why this particular practice is, and other things about how salvation works. And so that ultimately by the time we get to the end of 1520, Luther has sort of crossed the line. He's to the point now that the Pope is ready to formally excommunicate him because he hasn't recanted. And Luther has continued to write and now publish other things which are carrying him further and further along the lines of wanting to reform the church's beliefs. And so finally, in early 1521, the actual excommunication happens. So now we get to the point that sort of is the most critical of all. Who's heard of the Diet of Worms?
I think we discussed that briefly last week. But it's not what it sounds like it is.
No, it's not somebody eating only worms. So his ideas, again, are starting to circulate throughout Europe, the newly published books and pamphlets. Eventually what happens here is European leaders loyal to the church and to the Pope call together a council, but the council is not exclusively about, it's a little bit misleading here in the slide that I pulled, it's not exclusively to try Luther on the grounds of heresy. This is after he's already been excommunicated formally by Leo the Pope in early 1521. The Diet is a gathering of all the political leaders, and it's under the behest and it's under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor. And so among the things that are going to be considered there is Luther's position, and Luther's going to have to come and do one of two things: either renounce and have the excommunication lifted, or if he's not willing to renounce, that essentially will be the formal finish of the process. He'll be considered a heretic, he's excommunicated, and then he is subject to being executed by any political authority who can get their hands on him. Basically, you have no protection at that point. Once you've been declared a heretic, you can be tried by any civil authority and you can be executed.
Is Brandenburg still the Archbishop?
Brandenburg is still the Archbishop for Mainz. And the other thing to note there is, did the church execute people for heresy?
Yes.
Yes and no. The church declared you a heretic, but the actual execution were carried out by civil authorities. So basically, it's almost like somebody who in the Old West had a bounty on their head. Once that was declared, anybody could execute it.
Kind of like Jesus.
Exactly. The Sanhedrin had lost the power to be able to execute life sentences, correct?
Right.
So in order to have Christ executed, crucified, who had to pass that order?
The political people.
The Roman political authority, who in that case was Pilate, had to pronounce that authority. And that's why he's crucified Christ is crucified not as a blasphemer, he's crucified as is in rebellion to Rome, being a traitor to Rome, because he's unwilling to submit to Roman thoughts about acknowledging the emperor as the ultimate authority. So Luther has been compelled to come to Worms in the middle of this. It's about 5 months long, if I remember correctly, that the Diet happens. And this is under Emperor Charles V. The Holy Roman Emperor is Charles V. But there's a really important person in Luther's life that I think we often lose track of, and that's this guy named Frederick. He's actually Frederick III. He's a prince, so he's one of these German princes. And he's an elector of Saxony. Elector meaning that he's a high enough level of prince that he's actually one of the ones who has the ability to be part of choosing who the Holy Roman Emperor will be. Sort of timely in the sense that we're coming up on an American election where we have this thing called the Electoral College.
Yeah.
It's a college of what? It's a college of electors. There were electors inside of the German principalities that were part of who determined who would be the Holy Roman Emperor. And Frederick III was one of these. And Frederick was protective of Luther. And so remember what happened to Jan Hus? Remember he was called down to answer for his positions and had been declared a heretic. He got safe passage there, but didn't get safe passage home. And so when Luther is in this position, because of what had happened a century before to Hus, Frederick and others intervene on Luther's behalf to make sure that he's going to have the right of safe passage to Worms. And he's also going to have the right of safe passage back to where he is in Saxony, which is where Wittenberg is on the way back. So Luther goes to the Diet of Worms underneath that protection, and he is ordered there to renounce his statements. And this is the famous thing where they bring him in. You'll see this a number of times. I didn't even pull a picture for this because there's so many of them out there, where they basically have this table that has all the stuff that he's ever written. And they basically ask Luther, did you write this? And Luther immediately does what?
He says yes.
Not immediately. I need a night to think about that. He will come back the next day and basically reaffirm the famous statement, I have to stand by this. I can, by my conscience, I can stand no other way. But again, you sort of get I think you get a better understanding of who Luther is still at this point, is that he still wants one more night to just make sure this is the path that he wants to choose. And so he's given the opportunity to come back the next day, and the next day he actually does formally say, yes, that's my writings. This is where I'm at. And so since he doesn't renounce what is viewed as heresy, he's considered a heretic still. He's been excommunicated, and now he is subject to everything that it means to be a heretic. So now he's there. They can't immediately seize him and execute him like they did with Hus. So Luther prepares to take advantage of the passage that he gets to go back to Saxony with. And does anybody know what happens on his way back to Saxony?
He's kidnapped.
He's kidnapped.
Yeah.
By whom?
Frederick's the third's people. And they presented themselves as bandits, but in reality, they were just trying to throw the system off by saying, hey, bandits got him. And the reality is that Frederick III picked him up and took him to a castle and hiding.
Yeah, so there's a
Bruce
little
Gordon
subterfuge.
describes it
Go ahead.
pretty, go ahead.
I didn't hear that.
Oh, I was going to say, Bruce Gordon describes it as pretty dramatic, exciting. Guys with black hoods grab him and throw him in a wagon and take off.
Yeah, covered his head in a hood, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Luther knew immediately. I think very quickly he discovered it because they told him so, but I don't think that Luther knew immediately that what was happening to him was actually a good thing.
Right.
So again, I just want to say this because this is a famous thing. I don't have the slide for it, but when he's asked if he's going to recant his writings, Luther supposedly said something like, here I stand and I can do no other, meaning that I can't recant what I've written because I believe what I've written is true and is in line with Scripture. What they ultimately did for Luther, and this is important for why he has to be kidnapped, and this is on the 25th of May in 1521, Luther is declared an outlaw, his literature is banned, and his arrest is required. And so in that warrant, it says we want him to be apprehended and punished as a notorious heretic. It also made it a crime in Germany for anyone to give Luther food or shelter, and anyone could kill Luther with no legal consequence.
Wow.
So understand that once this safe passage back, which has been negotiated, is over, Luther is a fugitive in every sense of the word. And anyone can kill him, and there's no consequence for doing so legally. So he gets kidnapped, which actually is being rescued by Frederick III, folks that were under his direction, and they end up spiriting him away to a place called Wartburg Castle. And Luther stays there for the better part of 5 or 6 years, basically, completely in hiding, grows a beard, claims that he's ends up taking on this persona of being like a low-grade knight. It's sort of an interesting little, has been and would be well dramatized in movies of him sort of, it's Luther on the lam, and he's being hidden out at Wartburg Castle.
So is the castle owned by Frederick?
It is. So Frederick is utilizing one of his remote properties as a place to hide Luther away, and that is Luther being hidden away. Now, while he's there, he continues to write, he continues to study, and one of the things he actually starts doing while he's at Wartburg Castle, he actually begins translating the Bible into German. More than once, Luther described his time at Wartburg as sort of his version of Patmos, of being placed on, it was his chance to be put into exile, but that exile was put to good use, and that enabled him to do the German translation and to continue other writings, and also think through many of the other areas that would become part of the Reformation, particularly the Lutheran part of the Reformation.
What was the name of the castle he was taken to?
Wartburg, Wartburg.
I got the impression
it's one of those nice up in the mountains, high German castle kind of things.
Yeah.
High walls. It very much looks like a German mountain castle if you see a picture of it.
And it's still standing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. In fact, it's a museum still to this day, and it's a very important location, locale in what is thought of as being, what we think of today as being Reformation history. I'm pulling up, see if I can pull up a picture here. So I'm going to pull this over, and it's just plain old-fashioned Google search. But there's the castle today, and you can go there and tour it. It's in from Germany today. That's not what I wanted to do.
There it is.
There it is. So as you can see, it's even today pretty secluded, high up in the mountains.
Yeah, but there's got to be people there. I mean, I would assume they're all loyal to Frederick, and so he's safe because he's inside his friend's castle.
Right. And there apparently is debate among historians and scholars as to how much did the forces, the Pope and others, know where Luther probably was, but they didn't want to make a big deal of pursuing him. He wasn't actively going around. Yes, he was still actively publishing and doing other things, but there is some question as to what extent it was sort of an open secret that this is what was happening with respect to Luther. Okay. Now I'm going to go up. Luther not only, though, initially opposed the selling of the indulgences. What I have here is just an overview list, and we'll be getting into this a lot more moving forward, because many of these are the tenets of the Reformation, particularly the second and third one. But eventually Luther comes to hold of the position that purgatory itself is a false doctrine. So he grows from being opposed to the selling of the indulgences, freeing those from purgatory, to actually challenging the very concept of purgatory itself. Most importantly, though, he moves forward with this concept of that salvation is through faith alone, and that the Bible should be the final authority for truth, limiting the number of sacraments in the church to baptism and the Last Supper, because they're the only two that had scriptural support. They have the question about whether the Eucharist, whether the actual act of the Mass, whether it was actually transubstantiation, where it's the transformation of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. And again, these ideas were published into books on printing presses by Luther, and as a result, his ideas circulate much faster. So one of the things I think that's important to draw out, particularly in contrast, is some of these thoughts even were not completely new to Luther. We found them back with Wycliffe and with Huss. What's the difference at the time that Wycliffe and Huss, there's no printing press to
It's all
move
oral.
these thoughts rapidly around what was Christendom at the time.
Can you go back to that other page where it's some of the things he says?
So for those, yeah, so those of you that went to, remember going when we did the tour of the Bible Museum out at HBU? I mean, one of the things that we focused on there was the room that they had where they had the sample, remember the sample of the Gutenberg press? That was important for the printing of Bibles in the language, but it wasn't just Bibles that were able to be printed now. The theses were printed, Luther's other books. So the Reformation hits this interesting point in time that allowed it to catch hold because of the particular abuse that led Luther to want to raise the question, the Tetzel von Brandenburg selling of indulgences, this sort of extreme version of this. But it's also after there's been the Black Death, there's been a change in the economy and the social structure for much of Europe. There's been a change inside the church because of that. The church is coming off 2 pretty bad centuries of schisms and divisions and arguments, and some really bad popes who did some really bad things. The setting all comes together, and then of course what's tied with that is the ability now to publish and transmit documents fairly quickly. So this is a unique point in history that sort of brings all of those forces together to make it happen.
God's providence,
God's providence.
just like when Christ came.
Yeah, and selecting a reluctant reformer
Yeah.
in the form of Luther, who ends up being initially the catalyst, but then becomes a leader. The thing that also struck me, and I've watched so many different documentaries and so many different things and read so much, getting ready for this part. Again, that idea of reluctance is there with Luther. There's a way that this could have gone where Luther could have just started the fire and then backed out. I think by the time that his theses had been published, you could imagine a scenario where Luther could have said, I recant because I don't want to take the heat. But that would have not meant the end of the thoughts that he was expressing there. But he could not do that because that was not who he was. That was not his character. And so we find him then suddenly in the middle of what started out as a reformation, but what ends up being more of a revolution against the church. Thoughts, comments? So what we will actually pick up on next week is we will start actually diving down into some of these particular ideas that are the ideas of the Reformation. So we're going to talk about sola scriptura, that the Bible is the authority. We're going to talk about salvation. So we're going to go back and pick up on those concepts of what was the Catholic view of salvation, the satisfaction view, and we're going to look to see how that's different than the view that Luther puts forth. And we're going to see how all of this starts to come together in the movement of the Reformation, changing and creating a new doctrinal position that is distinct from the doctrinal position that you would have understood coming out of the backside of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215.
You said purgatory was kind of late. Doctrine didn't come around. Do we know who started the doctrine of purgatory?
You first start seeing it expressed sometime around the 10th and 11th century through a number of different theological writers. It gets firmly established, though, in the Lateran Council and the periods of time directly after that.
And the church still believes in it. The Catholic Church still believes in it, but with only that it exists.
And there's something we can do to pray for people that are there.
So when they were doing the thing about you drop your money in to get this indulgence and you get people out, I still don't understand, like, when do you understand if they're out if you haven't bought an indulgence? Does the church still sell indulgences today?
You can still obtain indulgences, and one of the ways you can obtain that is through special giving.
But like a piece of paper thing with the picture of the Pope and all of that, like the ones you've shown us before with Mary or with the Pope on it? I mean, like, can I get one of those today? Order off the internet.
I don't think you can buy
papal indulgence.
I don't think you can do one online. But notice here, this one in I think that's in Italian, or Latin, it's in Italian, is an indulgent. This is a plenary indulgence. Indulgentia plenaria.
Wow.
This is a good place to start because if we go too much beyond this, we're going to split up the first concept that I want to get into, which is Luther coming to the understanding of salvation through faith alone. And that's closely tied to his relationship with the Bible. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.